Well, here we are, green light time, right? I'm always reminded when that happens of old days at Kmart where they announced the blue light special. Some of you don't even know Kmart, let alone blue light special. Well, we'll talk more about life episodes later on. Mass communication, mass-mediated communication. When Dr. Bryant, who is, I would argue, the leading scholar in the United States on media theory, mass media theory, teaches at the University of Alabama, has a distinguished chair there, big research lab, all of that sort of stuff. When we did the first edition of this, as I recall, we called this chapter Mass Communication. Can we get the slides up, the PowerPoint? There it is. Okay. Mass communication. Then we realized that's really the wrong name for the chapter. To give you the impressions that we want to give you, the theory and so forth, the experience and the phenomena that we're looking at, the words mass-mediated have to become a very central part of our discussion and our analysis. Let's talk a little bit about what that means. Mass simply means the ability of one entity to disseminate information, opinion, entertainment, persuasion to a lot of individuals. Mass. And we're communicating with you as though you are a mass. And one of the characteristics of a mass is I may not know who you are, because you're watching television in Kentucky, and I've never been to Kentucky. So I may not know who you are, but I'm attempting to communicate with you. Also in mass, we can talk about mass society. One of the questions that we have in policy issues are very central to the study of mass-mediated communication. To what extent do we destroy the possibilities of independent thinking, regional identity, demographic pride by saying that if we're communicating with everybody in the same way with the same message, that we now expect and perhaps even predict that you are thinking more alike, more homogeneous as a society, rather than being heterogeneous, independent in thought and spirit and will on matters relevant to purchasing, advertising, politics, perhaps advertising, news, programming, and even programming. Can national network programming destroy local ethnic music, as an example? And there are pretty good examples of where it had a pretty damaging effect. Hollywood, New York City tells us what is entertaining, therefore what is local and entertaining may have a harder time surviving in a mass society. So it becomes something sort of worth thinking about. Mediated means that we become interested in the nature of a variety of media, but that we're always sensitive to the fact that in the communication process, there is an identifiable technology. There is an identifiable technology. It could be print. It could be electronic. Electronic resubdivides. Could be film, etc. Technology becomes important because part of what we discuss and discover in the evolution of technology, we'll see this even more in the last chapter, is the potentiality that each new technology has a deterministic effect upon communication for a given period of time. That's a kind of a complicated concept. I don't expect you to get it at first glance. But it's one of the things that is important for us to recognize. To what extent does the technology itself that predominates at a given time have a disproportionate effect upon the nature of mass-mediated communication? Therefore, is print different, and does it have a different effect on society from radio, from television, and now from the internet. So we become interested in those points of intervention. Well, going on down through this, let's see sort of what's going on. Mass-mediated communication, MMC theory, embraces information, persuasion, that all sounds together familiar, right? Interpersonal communication. I've argued along the way, and Dr. Bryant is one that argues rather resoundingly that if we think that interpersonal communication is not essential to mass-mediated communication in two ways, we really miss the boat. One is that a lot of what mass-mediated communication deals with, particularly entertainment, is indeed interpersonal communication. Therefore, I can use video clips of movies to show you something about interpersonal communication. Arguably, the content of news at various times is even interpersonal communication. One could argue that some of the not the lawsuit, but the criminal suit against, not de Guren, he was the defense attorney, but Durst, had to do with interpersonal communication between Durst and the fellow who ended up dead and dismembered and in the drink. Now some of you say, isn't that pushing it a bit far? Well, what are dramas about? And arguably, courtroom discussion is often a dramatic event, isn't it? Now, the content of media has a lot to do with interpersonal communication. But do we use media as a part of interpersonal communication? Does interpersonal communication play a role in, does mediated communication play a role in interpersonal communication? We sometimes go on dates. My wife and I go to movies together. We talk about movies, etc., etc. I've got a buddy bunch out in the country. We have a guy's day out. Last summer we went to the Italian Job together. No women allowed. We went to the movie. We had an ample amount of popcorn on the left and an ample amount of popcorn on the right. We went during the matinee. We could sit as far apart as we wanted. And if we wanted to, we could make noise and hoot and go on. It was a boys' day out, right? Interpersonal communication. Using mass media as a point of interest. Super Bowl parties at your house? The consumption of mass-mediated communication in an interpersonal setting. We talk a lot as we go along about the influence of parents and siblings on children's response to programming, news, and more importantly, advertising. Advertising. Meaning that as a child growing up, how I learn to interpret and use advertising messages may have a lot to do with what happens conversationally within my family. About products, about certain products, about advertising, certain ads, etc., etc., etc. So, it is a very vital part of our life. But it's integrated, not segregated. One of the themes that we try to argue throughout our book and throughout our lectures is that human communication can be segregated or contextualized for purposes of study, but that as human communicators, we communicate in many contexts, and those contexts often converge, overlap, interrelate in important ways, so that if we want to understand what's going on, we must never miss those connections. Mass communication is largely a 20th century concern. It's not to suggest that mass communication didn't happen in the 19th century, but it really got important in the 20th century for a variety of reasons. One, because of the development and proliferation of forms of mass and mediated communication, such as network radio and, more importantly, network television. What is the nature of a society where a disproportion of its entertainment communication is controlled by 3 networks? Now, some of you say, we can't imagine having only 3 networks. Well, try hard. I know that it's difficult, but try hard. CBS, ABC, and NBC. And when I was a farm boy in western Colorado, we didn't even get all 3 of them. So what you got was what somebody at a media elite institution said, we're going to provide this because we think there's a market for it out there.
Like when big conglomerates control everything, then there's not so much competition anymore, and I mean, actually news should be being reported because there are news and not because conglomerates control everything and it's not the truth anymore.
Well, truth is a relative concept, but certainly the question of who are the gatekeepers that judge what facts and maybe truth get through. Your country has a little company called Bertelsmann. Is that right? One of the largest in the world. I probably pronounce that different. Yeah, but they also own a lot of electronic media. I don't know whether they do film and all of that sort of stuff. It's big, huge. Big questions about when they move in to start influencing and muscling around and all of that. We have a large problem in the United States because a lot of radio outlets are controlled by very few corporate headquarters, right? What does that mean for the gathering, dissemination of entertainment, most importantly at times news?
Will it be influenced in a specific way, in one way?
Maybe. That's where we get into the issues. Maybe. Is influence only from the media, or is influence from many sources, and do the media maybe give disproportionate influence, or do they not? That's where some of this policy question comes in, doesn't it? But it is exactly the issue of policy that drives a great deal of mass communication, mass-mediated communication research. How does media fit in society? And does it influence disproportionate to other influences what happens in society? And there are all kinds of ideological issues which we will take up, philosophical issues, because we operate out of a variety of models as to what ought to be available. Should people be able to tell me stuff because they're out there gathering it that other people don't? When we get into the chapter 10 on the internet, we will then begin to see why the internet has become so popular, because it gives us access to a lot of stuff that some other organizations don't, or don't as easily. And then we have to deal with the P word, pornography. We can't avoid that as we get along. There are people that argue that the internet would never have survived if it hadn't been for pornography. Well, why did pornography have such an influence over the economic viability of the internet? It was because people could get access to stuff cheap and easy there that they would have to go out of their way, particularly if they lived in a small town. I have to drive some distance to get my porn. I can't just go downtown and say, hey, you got some porn. Everybody in town will know who I am. But in the secrecy of my little house, I can now download all of this stuff, right? It can change the nature of society. Yeah.
I've heard that same argument for the VHS beta wars as to why VHS won, because it was such a cheaper format.
Well, economics become a very real part of all of this. And arguably the networks that are the most economically competent, even to the extent that we have to build in the notion that arguably you can't stop anything that people want, even the download of digital music, because there's a market. It's driven. The other thing is, to what extent, now we're kind of jumping ahead, but we'll try to backfill and catch up with ourselves here. To what extent do we work out of a linear magic bullet model where the media put all of these ideas and control us, as opposed to using the model, paradigm, of the sovereign viewer, saying that viewers, because of markets, always drive media content because dollars pull content. And that if the dollars are there, we're the sovereign viewer. And one of the best bits of evidence of that is the cable television every year erodes the market share of the three major networks. Because I don't have to watch Seinfeld, because it's designed for you folks. Instead, I can watch the War Channel, which is a constant barrage of testosterone-driven stuff about people whacking one another over the head with clubs, or bombs, or battleships, or war machines. But I can pick and choose what I want. It's a menu. It is Luby's. It is a cafeteria. And we have to have that prospect. And your notion that what drives this is an economic model is a very real one. Very, very real one. Okay? Okay, development and proliferation of forms of mass and mediated communication. Question? Did I see a question out of the corner of my eye? Okay. Mass-mediated communication reflects the growth in the U.S. population, requiring the ability to communicate with lots of people across the nation. Don't know how many have ever been to a really small country. One of the things that surprised me dramatically was when I went to New Zealand. New Zealand's got a population of 4 million. They've got 3.5 television channels. One of them isn't even on 24 hours a day. 3.5, right? They don't have a lot of programming to drive that, so they have to get most of their programming from the United States, yuck, Australia, double yuck, or the motherland, oh well, good. Now that's not to suggest that New Zealand doesn't do some of its programming. And if you want to watch rugby, why not? They have rugby on hour after hour after hour because rugby is not an important part of their society. It is way more important than that. It's not a matter of life and death, as they say. It's really important. So you'll see a lot of rugby. Class C rugby, Class B rugby, Class D rugby, rugby games here, rugby games there, replays of rugby, 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 rugby. Rugby doesn't. When was the last time in America that you saw rugby on ESPN? See what I'm getting at? How it all works? Kinda? Huh? Okay. Yeah. Mass communication, mass-mediated communication reflects the growth in the United States population requiring the ability. Did I just say that? Is that just on the previous slide? Something similar to that, huh? What was the difference? I've lost sight. Sounds very similar to what I just said. Mass-mediated audiences are often heterogeneous, but they tend toward homogeneity. They tend toward homogeneity. Now, one of the things that happens with the proliferation of media is that we can drift back toward heterogeneity. The fewer the media, one argument is, the more we are alike and similar. That also then scares the New Zealanders as an example, because the New Zealanders like to think that they are New Zealanders. They don't like to think of themselves as Australians. They really don't like Americans all that much. They kind of admire the British, but what they like to have on their television is a set of images that tell them something about themselves. Here we can find that because we are an information-rich, media-rich society, right? Now, my guess is that media streaming in places like New Zealand is likely to get going even quicker than in the United States because it gives those people access to stuff which is harder to get than it is for us to get in the United States. Meaning that we've always got cable, we've always got satellite. We've got a lot of stuff to choose from, whereas they may have far less. I mentioned before that mass-communicated, mass-mediated audiences are often anonymous to the source. The Wall Street Journal sends me a pound of paper every day, but they don't know much about who I am except They've talked to me a couple of times, said thank you for citing us so often. Thank you for handing out so much in class to your students. And by the way, you get a 50% discount because you do that. We like that. You're helping us to sell newspapers, we believe. And then they even offer me stuff that I could do more to market their newspaper with you. The Chronicle has no idea who I am, particularly now that I'm no longer a subscriber. They might poll, but if they do, they're going to poll by demographic, not by individual, right? Mass-mediated communication audiences are connected by a unique technology. And by unique, I'm saying that television is different than radio, which is different than print, which is different than the internet, which is different than film. Feedback occurs, you may remember that from Chapter 2, interaction, we can call it, but often in fairly difficult and different ways. Letters to the editor. If I don't like your newspaper, I can actually not subscribe. Or your magazine, I can not subscribe. Does that tell you something if I don't subscribe? If I don't like your radio station, I can tune in somebody else. If I don't like your television, I can tune in somebody else. Now, one of the things that's interesting is I'm told, don't know whether it's true, but in cable and satellite, they can actually tell our watching profiles. Anything that is computer assisted, they can monitor us. That's kind of scary sometimes, though, isn't it? People in companies know, if they don't, they should, that if they are doing something on the internet with the company mainframe that they ought not to be doing, that somebody in the company may find that out and they could get sacked. Where my wife worked, there was a notice put out, there will be no consumption of pornography, etc., 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 on company time using company computers, etc., 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 and a number of people got fired from her company for violating that. They can monitor it. Anonymity ends when they can do things, whatever in the heck a cookie is. I have not the foggiest notion, but there is this notion they can drop a cookie on you. I don't know what it is. I'm always worried at the end of a day with the internet, how many cookies did I get or did I not get? But it's out there, right? MMC contains messages not addressed to specific individuals necessarily, but to specific audiences. Demographics. Demographics. You will watch television in your lifetime that I will pay no attention to. I've had to watch segments of Friends, which my daughter and son-in-law loved, merely because I thought I ought to know something about what I was getting as video clips for you to think about in this class. But it's frankly terribly boring to me. Really is terribly boring. I'm just not worried about whether 23-year-old people like me or not, or what they do to interact with one another. I just don't. And they know it. Because they don't want me to be watching that. They want you to be watching it because they want you to get the advertising messages that are designed to your demographics. And they know where you are, and they know what you want, and they're telling you all day long, come look at what we've got for you at this particular time segment because it is designed for you demographically, children and so forth, etc., etc. I now, because of my grandchildren, know more about toys than I can say that I did since when my daughter was a child. Because if I don't have children close at hand that I have to know what their toys are, their toy preferences are, why in the world would I watch Dora the Explorer? Or Builder Bob, or whatever it was. When I had my sweet little daughter beside me on Saturday morning, we used to watch Land of the Lost. Now, I'm not going to ask any of you how many of you remember Land of the Lost. But you can get the point that I'm making. Why was I there that morning? Because she and I, we had the beanbag chair out, we had hot chocolate, we were just cozy. And it's also interpersonal. Did I mention interpersonal? Is that interpersonal? My grandson had a little rash, didn't feel good the other day, so he and I sat together, lovey little guys, he has a way of reaching over and pulling your ear if he feels insecure. There we were, Hoss and Keene, together watching Blue's Clues. Big dramatic event in my life. Frankly, I don't like Blue's Clues. But I adore my grandson. So you see sort of how it works? Actually, I think Blue's Clues is pretty good to tell you something about how communication works, where you got to go through this set of events to see how you progress through a conversation from point A to point C, D, and E. Okay? MC is rapid, increasingly so. Years and years and years and years and years ago, I used to delight in reading newspapers. They were old newspapers even then. This was when I was interested in some topics that would take me back to read in the 1840s and the 50s about the time that telegraphic news came up. And in the middle section of newspapers, you would have these lightning bolts called telegraphic news. Telegraphic news meant that the news was sent from point A to point B with the speed of telegraphy. That meant that somebody had to go out and write the story, get the story, write the story. Somebody had to punch the story into Morse code. It had to come out on the other end. Somebody had to decode the Morse code. They had to rewrite the story. And then they had to decide what to put into the newspaper. Electronic news. I was listening to a CNN anchor one day talk about being on the air, talking about an event where Yitzhak Rabin was at a festival in Israel. She was talking about that, knowing that he had been assassinated. He was dead. She was talking about it as though he were alive because they didn't know anything about why he had been killed. CNN admits that it at times can get news faster than it can report news. And CNN is probably as good or better than anybody out there. On a given day, particularly now with camera phones or whatever they're called, anyone anywhere in the world can become a reporter in almost instantaneous click, 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 and there it is all over the world. Rapid and increasingly so. Increasingly slow. One of the arguments why the British government could not respond to the complaints of the American colonists was it took months for messages to go back and forth. Why were some of the great moments in communication simply the ability to communicate over distance faster, so important? Transatlantic telephone and telegraph. Big deal. Speed, over time, over distance. We'll talk about that even more in the last chapter. Messages are often transient. Electronic messages are often very transient, whereas print messages are not. It's interesting to imagine what communication in an organization is like today at an archival letter with internet. I had a graduate student do some work on Enron. She had worked at Enron. She and other people had kept email messages. But notice how transient email can be until you're that specialist that can go into the mainframes, I mean not the mainframes, but the hard drives or whatever it is, and get those messages that are stored back there that we think are eliminated. And one guy said the only way that you can really get all that out of your computer is to burn it up, blow it up, destroy it, and then maybe we can still get it back. Scary. It's still there. But you got to be an expert to go in and get it. Well, what does the MMC stuff do for us? Surveillance? Do I have to know somebody in Baghdad? Hey, what's going on in Baghdad today? Tell me about it. Or can I tune in during the day to the news and have somebody out there tell me whatever they tell me? They may not answer my questions. They're probably trying to, but remember, I'm anonymous to them. Correlation, simply drawing things together, making connections. Editorialists, opinion writers, and so forth often do this. To what extent does the mass-mediated communication transmit culture? I swear, that if, for some reason, the New Zealanders could not get rugby, that would be a tragedy. And you know what? As far as I know, they don't care about American football. But we do. So we have a big mass-mediated event called the Super Bowl. And we're supposed to all tune in so that we can see the halftime ads and do all of that kind of thing. It is a big event. It's a big deal. What's the difference between our culture and their culture? We like football, American football. They don't. Well, you go to some place like Brazil. One of the things that I found interesting was, years ago I had some rental properties. We had people who would rent from us who were often from South America, Central America, Mexico, and they wanted cable very quickly. If they could possibly get it, they wanted it because it was a way of keeping in contact with their culture, particularly a very vital part of their culture, which is soccer. Soccer. It's important. It's important. I talked to a fellow from Televisa, which is the big media company in Mexico City, saying that one of the great problems they have is that they provide so much feed to the rest of Central South America that other countries complain that we're becoming Mexicanized. Your culture is not our culture. What's interesting also is that there are people abroad who used to years ago imagine that Americans rode around on horses, wore big hats, and shot each other because we had so much stuff on television called Westerns. Haven't had any of those lately. Now we're interested in body parts and crime scenes and all of that sort of stuff. I cannot imagine what the rest of the world thinks about us. Culture and entertainment. Entertainment. Roughly, MMC divides into information, news, persuasion, advertising, entertainment, sitcom, sports, for instance. But then we know that sports is informative, who won or lost. It may be persuasive, our town is better than your town. Our state is better than your state. Sometimes the news is entertaining. Sometimes the news is persuasive. Sometimes advertising is informative. Sometimes advertising is entertaining. It's altogether possible that you like ads for products that you've never bought. You may have loved Budweiser's frogs, but hated the notion that people even drank beer. But I bet those frogs were at various times amusing, okay? So I sort of talk about that. All of that simplification of advertising being et cetera, can be an overgeneralization. News may be entertaining, sitcoms may be informative, news may be persuasive, ads may be informative, even in ways that harm the interest of the marketers. They may tell us about their products in ways that scare us off. MMC creates and conforms to culture. One of the things about mass-mediated communication is it never gets too far away from culture to lose its markets. It took a lot of time and effort, demographic study, maybe even a modest amount of courage for someone like Ellen DeGeneres, or whatever her name is, you know, I don't, to come out on television. Now, it wasn't a big surprise. But the point is that television never likes to get very far ahead of its market. What it talks about has to be acceptable enough that people find it entertaining, amusing, not threatening, etc., etc. And even Rush attracts liberals who scream, no, rather than yes, but he does. Mass-mediated communication often is not the actual originator of information, thought, or action, but a channel for others, like public relations people, who are not employed by the media, to use the media to get their point across. Advertising as well. Mass-mediated communication may be shaped inevitably and deterministically, both by advertising dollars and the inherent nature of each medium. That's a big statement. That's a semester-long graduate seminar right there. First of all, There is a whole body of literature which we'll talk about later on that suggests that what we see on television in terms of news as well as editorial and entertainment programming is driven by advertising dollars. And if advertisers don't like it, it isn't going to appear on television, as an example. Big battles over that. More importantly, remember a while ago when I was talking about deterministic? The notion of determinism suggests that each medium that dominates does so until another medium comes along to replace it. Print dominated until radio came along. Radio was interesting in a variety of ways. One of the ways was, although I do see people reading while they drive on the freeway, some of you may do that, but radio we could do while we were doing other things. We could listen to music while we were reading. My daughter used to do calculus while watching MTV. Maybe that accounts. No, I'm just teasing. Now, we've got television that comes along. Why did we like television more than radio? We can see things. Each medium replaces each previous medium, and you can't stop it. Is there any stopping of the internet? No. Will the internet change the nature of television? It's already changed the nature of music, isn't it? Already changed a lot of things. The medium as a medium. A guy by the name of Marshall McLuhan, working as a second-generation thinker. The first generation, a guy by the name of Harold Innis. Harold Innis argued that society has changed by each major technological innovation that occurs. There is an argument that the innovation of the horse collar, a collar that goes around a horse's neck that allows a horse to pull a heavier weight, ended up with a lot of people no longer being needed for agricultural work in Europe. Where did they go? They went to the city. What happened when they got to the city? They killed a bunch of cats. And then the cats weren't there to eat the rats that were carrying the bubonic plague. And we had the bubonic plague because there were too many people living in bad conditions in a city without cats to kill the rats. Technology changes things. Innis said, steam engines come along, they replace non-steam engines. Jet airplanes come along, they replace certain sorts of things. He was a Canadian economist. He got interested at various times talking about the media and how each medium would deterministically reshape the nature of society. He spawned a guy by the name of Marshall McLuhan, who became a cultural icon. If you listen to old reruns of Laugh-In, they will say, "What are you doing, Mr. McLuhan?" And he was revolutionizing us by telling us that the medium, you may remember this from chapter 2, the medium is the message. That's freaky. The medium is the message. Is television a different message than newspaper, print? Arguably, one of the things that failed on the internet first out was people that wanted to just merely put their newspapers on the internet. There was something different about the medium that said we don't just want that. I knew a young woman that had a pretty high level position with WashingtonPost.com, and she said we hired young people who had never been in the newspaper business for very long because what we didn't want was just to put our newspaper up on the web. It had to be a web newspaper. Kids understood the web and made the adaptation that would make it a useful newspaper in a new generation, because not the message was different per se, but it was the medium which then essentially changes the nature of the message. There is an argument that the linear reading population, the old folks, the establishment, could not understand and respond to the students who were a non-linear population by 1960, and that the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and all of these movements were a non-linear society fighting against a linear society. Popular thesis. I could give you citations. Interesting to me. So, the nature of all of this is deterministically shaped. Some of the premature perspectives that we took in this whole business, one was dominant effects model. The magic bullet effect, linear transmission of information model. It led us to conclusions that are absolutely wrong. One of the great worries, using what was often called the propagandistic model, and you may remember I argued that propaganda was one of the antecedent studies to mass communication studies, etc., etc. In Chapter 2 we talk about that, occurred because people were afraid that a few people in the media elite could control society by controlling the messages that got into the medium. Because it's a linear model. We have a funnel in the top of our head. We have a hole in the top of our head, and the media elite simply pour information in, and we can only think one way, their way. What's the evidence that that may not be true? A little country called Russia. With a controlled medium, they didn't all have the same thoughts. They also had a habit of sending people off to the loony bin if you disagreed with government. Mass moved people from being heterogeneous different to being homogeneous the same. Now we're going back to being heterogeneous again, probably. Mass both referred to the medium, as I said before, a way to reach lots of people, and the impact on people, making them increasingly more compliant and fundamentally less critical of what was going on. Even passive. The notion of the passive couch potato became a real concern in our society, still is. There's a lot of worry that the amount of televiewing that children engage in a very passive way can be destructive to the development of the child's imagination, the child's etc., including health. We talk about that later on. A wonderful writer by the name of Van Evera gives us some insight into that, which we may get to today. Hope so. Hypodermic, I push information and persuasive influence into you as I give you a flu vaccination. Dominant effects model. Is that what goes on? The dominant effects model works on the notion that the media are highly institutionalized and dominated by powerful financial, including advertisers that pay the freight, and political elites. Every year when NPR radio comes out, public broadcast radio, and petitions for us to give money, they have implied that the editorial control that they have is different if they don't have big corporate dominant sponsors deciding what is news and newsworthy. The propaganda model was we load messages, we aim, we fire, and we produce dominant and direct effects. Well, my friend Dr. Bryant, who was primarily responsible for this chapter, says, well, might not always just work that way. Some of this was challenged by reinforcement theory. You might remember, it's a clever name, that in Chapter 2 I mentioned a guy by the name of Clapper. K-L-L-A-P-E-R. Clapper said, in a sense, that dominant effects is claptrap. A little bit of a pun intended. I could have even played on that name a little differently, but I won't on television. He said, for instance, the evidence is pretty good that we're selective in terms of what we pay attention to. I don't just watch everything mindlessly, particularly after I'm a little older, but certainly even my grandchildren. They're not likely to sit there and watch the evening news. I'll tell you that, folks. They are quite selective. They're even demanding. I want to watch Littlefoot. I want to watch Dora the Explorer. Now, some of you have no idea what I'm talking about, because you don't have grandchildren or children, right? They know what they want. They are selective in that regard. And aren't we all, particularly if we're given the chance, aren't we selective? We expose ourselves to that which we think is interesting, newsworthy, informative, entertaining. We have so much available in this cafeteria that we don't pay attention to everything. So we're selective in what we pay attention to. Are we selective in how we pay attention to it, interpret it, see it? Will I see Blue's Clues the same way my grandson does? Will I see Friends the same way you do? Or if you're a woman, will you see Friends differently than if you're a man? And so forth, and so forth, and so forth. Advertising. Products that appeal to me may not appeal to you. Products that appeal to you may not appeal to me, etc., etc. Selective recall. Do we remember everything just right? Many of us go out and see a movie with somebody, go out, we talk about it, and it's as if we just saw the different movie. Well, I didn't see that. I didn't pay any attention to that. Yeah, I remember that. And then give us 3 weeks, and I've told you once that I said in a moment of romantic frenzy to my wife, that's our song. She remembered it. I still don't know what that song is. She will not tell me. She will hold it against me for the next 38 years of our marriage. We recall things differently. We get screwed up in that regard. What I think I saw in the news, I may never have seen on the news. One of the clips that I've provided for you, I hope it's up on the web CT, has to do with the footage from the hours shortly after the American forces took Baghdad, and part of that was the tearing down of one of the statues of Saddam Hussein. Very, very widely viewed in the United States. When we experience stuff like that, we probably see it differently. If I'm sitting next to an Iraqi, am I likely to see that different than I'm sitting next to it from somebody from Fayette County? See what I'm getting at? We see it differently, we remember it differently, we think of it differently, and all of this kind of stuff. Do I see it as a triumph? Do I see it as not a triumph? So that even something like the portrayal of the news. Now, what's also interesting is those images which we share somehow begin to get locked into our memory and our mind and become a residue for subsequent news interpretation, etc., etc. Will you ever in your lifetime not be able to call up the vision of the 2 planes flying into the World Trade Center? They're sort of there in your mind if you saw that. People have even said that the one man that fell to his death is an image that should never have been put on television because it was an intrusion into an enormously private time of his life. The last few seconds. That should not have been newsworthy. Interesting. Interesting, isn't it? But some of you will have the vision of the man in what is often characterized, and it was a guy that was an expert black and white photographer that dealt with that, saying it is one of the most beautiful moments in life and death that anyone can ever experience. An interesting way of looking at it, right? How do we interpret it? How do we recall it? What do we think of? You see why we then say there is an empowered audience out there. Not everybody responds in exactly the same way. We seek to confirm rather than disconfirm. More often than not, we don't tune in to Rush to have Rush tell us to be conservative if we're a dyed-in-the-wool liberal. We don't tune in to Oprah if we don't believe that Oprah is going to confirm us. Don't we like Judge Judy because Judge Judy is typically going to find the people guilty that we think are guilty too? There is a just world. Oh, do you remember that from attribution theory? There is a just world. We like that just world to be played out. But the irony of it is our sense of justice. And we like that confirmed, don't we? We don't like that disconfirmed. We like to sort of have things hold together. We attend, we think, we retain, we recall, we use information and persuasive influence in ways that suggest that we are more likely to reinforce what we think than to merely be manipulated by television. Now, it's interesting that to worry about children being manipulated, children may be more sensitive to some of these messages because they have less in their minds, stored away, attitudes well-formed, beliefs well-formed to use to critique what it is that they see and hear. Which means then that if they watch television with siblings older, their evaluation of toys, how much fun the toy will be, is likely to be influenced by the siblings' attitudes and comments, or the parents' attitudes and comments. So a lot of influence on children by television is mediated by interpersonal communication in a family setting. Interesting phenomenon. Dr. Bryan is one of the cutting-edge people in that research. Challenged by views of people as more thinking, autonomous, unique, challenged by the assumption that each category, demographic category, seeks information, entertainment, persuasion, unique to them, idiosyncratically satisfying, all of that proven over and over and over again by issues that we've talked about like media richness, demographic tailoring, and all of that sort of stuff. So what we can come down to is the notion that we are sovereign, and in many ways we decide which medium is best because of how it serves us. Each medium is more than a channel. It is also a way of thinking and organizing messages and impressions of the world around us. People may influence media as much or more than media affect them. I don't know whether you believe that or not, but there is a lot of information out there that suggests that reporters, editors, entertainment people are trying like the devil to figure out what amuses you. They are chasing you, waving, hey, come here, come here, come here, take a look. Because they want to be able to sell ad dollars, because ad dollars are what make them available to you. So there's a synergism out there. These are some of the big battles. Social categories theory suggests that the impact of media has a lot to do with our own demographic sense of whom we are, attendant to the preferences, the attitudes, the beliefs and motivations that we may have, that we've developed over time to deal with the uncertainties of life, to manage our life, etc. This impact reflects the need people have based upon our demographic category, can even influence whether we believe or disbelieve the news, as an example. So the news is not just purely, quote, informative, and it tailors to various subculture preferences, particularly as we have more media that can do that. I did not know until I got satellite that there's actually a women's channel where there's nothing but chick flicks. Pretty good movies over there, frankly. But there you go, right? Chick flicks. I guess that's the counterpoint to the testosterone. There's also a men's channel, but I find that kind of bad. But I do like Bombs Away on the History Channel and some of those. Well, tell you more about myself, right, than I want to. Mass media communication, interpersonal communication interact to explain why audience effects occur. We talk about that. Network flow of messages and influence. Carry that out of the chapters on organizational. Opinion leaders' roles in the process. Opinion leaders are very, very important. Brokaw, Dan Rather, Rush Limbaugh. Personalities can intervene to influence the kind of news that is gathered, the way in which the news is reported. I think that a lot of people believe that Cronkite and Severide finally convinced the American people that they didn't like the war in Vietnam. Cronkite and Severide, Eric Severide and Cronkite, on every night, night after night after night, saying, look at this little tedious war that isn't going anywhere and American lives are being lost. We're having all kinds of potential atrocities in the name of something we're not entirely sure. Tedious, tedious, tedious war, and people said, we're tired of it. Typically, opinion leaders within your environment are heavy media utilizers. Opinion leaders are more selective in the media that they use, attention to the media that they give, interpretation of those messages, willingness to yield to messages. In your life, for instance, are there people who influence what you look at, what you pay attention to? Oh, did you see on television? Or did you see that ad for this product? Or you know, I think that Bill White is really good, or I think Orlando Sanchez is really, really good, or whatever it might be. Or I think White is a crook. I think that Sanchez is incompetent. They influence our judgment, opinion leaders. We discovered years ago that opinion leaders influence over us in terms of what we see and what we watch and what we hear and how we interpret it can be very important. A study conducted as television was becoming increasingly popular. Thousands of interviews were conducted. People said to voters, what source of information, persuasive influence, campaign is more important to you? Wanting to see when television emerged as the dominant source. They figured that would be a mediated source, and they found out that it was interpersonal communication. People said, well, I talked it over with my friend, my buddy down at work, the woman that I buy dresses with. My mother influences me. Interpersonal communication. We developed what was called the two-step flow of information that even builds into a theory that we'll see later on called dependency theory. I'm often dependent upon other people that I'm in contact with, friends, to reinterpret the news and advertising and programming. And is it not true that my friendships are more important to me than my, well, televiewing, my news gathering, unless it is a part of my friendships, and we sometimes do this? Years ago I had some baseball buddies, and we had to watch the sports news, we had to read the newspaper to get ready for lunchtime conversation, to tell us each what we already knew. Opinion leaders hold prestige within a community. Opinion leaders have more issue and topic expertise. Opinion leaders may be influential even if not connected by interpersonal communication, and so forth. Well, all of this suggests what we said before, a two-step flow outlined in the chapter, so that instead of mass-mediated communication being purely downward from the medium to us, it may be very much interpreted, transmitted, reinterpreted by the interpersonal contacts that we have. Opinion leaders have at least one PowerPoint of identification with the influenced audiences, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. Well, some of the opinion leaders that we can turn to are also characters in sitcoms, news reporters, or whatever it might be. Let's talk about social cognitive social learning theory. Some of you may remember social learning theory. One of the first concerns that our old friend Albert Bandura had was that if children watch violence on television, will children will become violent? So what he did was to allow one group of children to see programming and then go into a playroom where there was Bobo the doll. Other children just went into the play area where there was Bobo the doll. The question was, will the children that saw the violent television or film or whatever medium was in those days be more violent? And he found that they were. Now, some people interpreted that as dominant effects. Children would not be violent if they didn't see violence. Now, those of you that have had children around know that they're pretty good at whacking each other well before the time, and if they're not whacking each other, they bite each other. My grandson, 2 years older than the granddaughter, was able to whack her. She wasn't very good at whacking, but she got very good at biting. She was a biter. So is fighting an inherent characteristic of the human animal there long before we ever watch it on Disney? As an aside, does Disney get away with a lot? Is Disney really R-rated? If you're a child, do you want to know about abusive stepmothers? Do you want to know about cats eating mice? Do you want to know about hunters cutting children's hearts out? Do you want to know about wolves eating mom? That was Bambi, if you forgot. Hunters shooting at you? Do you want that? My granddaughter saw the first few minutes of Nemo and said, I'm out of here. 2 years old, this isn't fun. I remember even hiding my eyes. Now, you're a much more jaundiced society. You have been raised on so much violence that it is to you like apple pie. We often have the argument that if it hadn't been for watching television which was violent, I would not have been violent, and therefore I am guilty of no crime of violence because television made me do it. Now that's an interesting hypothesis. Did television make us do it? You may remember that our old friend Bandura said there are 4 ways of forming an attitude. 1 is by direct experience. 2 is by getting information. 3 is by role-playing. And 4 is by modeling or observational learning. Remember that? You said, no, we forgot that. That was on the last test. I warned you. Albert Bandura would be back. Here he is. Now, our friend Van Evera and some of the folks that are interested in this as well, Tan, etc., on page 352 and 353 are 2 wonderful models that are way too complicated for us to spend a great deal of time looking at. But one of the things that's interesting is that they have a whole category which you can look at called attentional processes. So the question is whether I, as an adult, an adolescent, a mom or dad, or a child watch television, how do I do it? Do I see something about rewards out there? Are those rewards tangible? Are they social? Do I see punishment? Do I see justification? Do I see revenge? Do I see self-defense? How do I interpret those messages that I see? Retention processes. What do I remember? Do I remember what is rewarding? Do I remember what is disrewarding? Because keep in mind, Bandura said that we're busy each day of our life trying to create for ourselves attitudes that lead us to rewards and take us away from punishments or disrewards. Finally, when I have to make a decision, to what extent can I then recall and use what it is that is relevant to me? And then on down the line, the question is whether the TV violence, for instance, that I see somehow matches my performance. The argument is that a great deal of cognitive thinking has gone on between point A and point B. Bandura added to that by arguing it's a far more complex model. There are many, many intervening factors. And he also was willing to acknowledge that children trying out violence is not something that's terribly clever. The question is that if the people in the television had been punished, if the people that did the violence in television had been sent to timeout, they didn't get cake, they had to go to bed at 8 o'clock, would the kids then have gone in and punched Bobos at all? Meaning that he recognized himself that there were only apparent positive rewards. Why was it forever then that Hollywood always made sure that at the end of the movie the bad guys were dead or in the clink? Because they didn't want people to say you can get away with a crime. Nowadays it gets fuzzier. The Italian Job, I think they ended up with loot. But they'd taken it from bad people to begin with, right? But you see what I'm getting at is what is the reward? What are the advantages? What are the costs? And the argument is that what we're trying to do is to figure this out. And is that advertising? If I see a wonderful sports car zooming across the countryside, don't I want it? If I like sports cars zooming across the countryside, to what extent can I too use that attitude? Well, I can't even afford the car. Maybe I can think about the car. Maybe I can at least go down and play a game for 25 cents, a video game called Drive a Car. You see, something like that. But does that mean that I don't like sensations? Do I not like certain kinds of thrills? The argument, according to Bandura and others, is that it's a very, very complicated model and that people around us can influence what it is that we see. I believe, for instance, that one of the reasons, this is another reason why I've provided for you how to dump a guy in 10 days. I really believe that one of the reasons that guys don't like to see chick flicks is because then their girlfriend, their wife, their significant other can say, see, that's what I've been trying to tell you. This is social learning time, bozo. See, I'm trying to get my message across here. See, this is a training film. See, and so forth and so forth and so forth. So you see how much it is really a part of our lives. Well, that's enough for today. We'll see what we can do to finish this chapter in the next 2 lectures.